A week after I buried my husband, my son looked me straight in the eye and said, "You should pack your things and go, Mom. This house isn't yours." Then my daughter-in-law handed me an empty savings passbook, a stark reminder that I had nothing left in this world but a void. I gave birth to him, I raised him, all for him to say that to me one day. If you've ever been a mother, a wife, or simply someone who has been treated like a burden by your own flesh and blood, I hope you'll stay until the end of this story. Perhaps somewhere in the journey I'm about to share you will find a piece of yourself. And if you've ever been in my shoes, please leave a comment. Let me know I'm not alone. My name is Elaine Whitmore. I am 71 years old, and this is a story I never thought I would have to tell. It began on an ordinary Wednesday evening, but after the death of my husband Charles, nothing was ordinary anymore. I still remember the ticking of the old wall clock. Charles was the one who wound it every Sunday. No one had wound it last week, so it was 2 hours slow, and I didn't have the heart to care. The house was too quiet, not a peaceful quiet. It was the kind of quiet where even the air seemed to tiptoe, afraid to touch a wound that hadn't healed. Charles had died from a stroke right in the bathroom. I found him while the water was still running. For a whole week I hadn't dared to step back into that room. Dinner that night was the first time my son Derek, his wife Tessa, and I had eaten together since the funeral. I'd made the beef stew Charles loved most. I don't know why. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was because I didn't know what else to cook. Tessa sat down at the head of the table without asking. She put on some soft music from her phone, then began arranging the plates as if this were her private restaurant. Derek quietly took his seat, the very chair Charles used to sit in. I couldn't help but stare at the empty space. His chair was still slightly angled, as if he might turn to chat at any moment. But tonight no warm voice would break the silence. I poured the water. Tessa reached for the salt. Derek never once looked at me. We ate for about 5 minutes before Tessa set down her spoon. Her movement was slow, deliberate, as if she were about to give a presentation. "Elaine," she said, her voice light as if she were merely suggesting an idea, "I think you should consider moving somewhere smaller, more manageable. This house is far too big for one person, and it's just not financially practical." I froze. I wasn't sure I'd heard her correctly. What? Derek frowned, glanced at his wife, then nodded like a shadow in agreement. "I think so too, Mom. You know, maintaining a house this large, the cost, the effort. It's a lot for you." I let my fork clatter onto my plate, my chest tightening. "This is the house I lived in for 32 years with your father." Tessa smiled. A tight-lipped smile devoid of any warmth. Then she pulled out a small white envelope and placed it gently on the table. "We thought you might need a little help getting started on a new plan." I picked it up. My hands were trembling, but I tried to keep them steady. Inside was a savings passbook. 0 balance, not a single dollar. As empty as their eyes when they looked at me. "What is this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Tessa shrugged. "It's a symbolic gesture, you understand." Everything he had was ultimately meant for his children and grandchildren. I looked up at my son. "What do you think about this, Derek?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on his plate, and he let out a long breath. "Mom, Tessa's right. We're going to start our own family soon. This house, it would be perfect. I couldn't believe it." The son I had stayed up all night with when he had a fever, the son I had packed sandwiches for in middle school because he hated the cafeteria. Food was now sitting in front of me, a stranger smiling as he kicked me out of my own home. I didn't say another word. I stood up neatly without spilling a glass. I walked upstairs to the bedroom that still smelled of Charles, where the reading glasses he'd left behind still sat on the nightstand. I sat down next to the safe. Charles had kept the key, but he'd given me the combination years ago. Just in case something happens, he'd said, I never thought I'd have to open it alone. My hands shook as I entered the code. I opened the safe, flipped past a few envelopes, some old photos, and then I saw it, a thin file, carefully stapled, labeled in Charles's handwriting, open only when necessary. I clutched the file in my hands. That night, I didn't cry. I just sat there in the darkness of the room, listening to the wind sweep across the roof, and knew that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same. Don't leave this story. If you've ever witnessed a betrayal like this, I hope you'll share a word of support. I couldn't sleep after that dinner. I lay awake all night staring at the ceiling. My mind a tangled mess of old yarn that Charles would never throw out, because you never know when you'll need to mend something. There wasn't much left for me to mend now. The cracks were spreading, and I'm not talking about the one in the kitchen wall. The next morning I made coffee out of habit, but it just grew cold in my hands. The house was the same as always, quiet, but this time it was a quiet that made you afraid to breathe. Charles wasn't there to turn on the morning radio. There was no clinking of a spoon stirring sugar, no grumble from him when the power flickered. Just the ticking of the clock as if it were counting down the time I had left. I decided to go to the bank. Charles had always handled the paperwork, the accounts. I hadn't been there by myself in 30 years. Honestly, I used to find it convenient. Now I felt like a fool. The drive wasn't long, but every time I shifted gears, my hands felt stiff. It was as if my own body was protesting. The bank's automatic doors slid open, and a blast of cold air conditioning hit my neck, making me shiver. I walked to the counter, trying to appear calm, but I couldn't hide the fact that I'd never done this on my own. "Hello, I'm Elaine Whitmore. I'd like to review the accounts in my name and my husband's Charles." The woman behind the counter looked up, a familiar face, Helen. In her 40s, with thin-rimmed glasses and a silver H pendant necklace. "Oh, Mrs. Whitmore," her voice softened. "I'm so very sorry for your loss. Mr. Charles always asked about my granddaughter every time he came in. A true gentleman." I nodded, my eyes suddenly stinging. "Thank you." Helen invited me into a back office to sit more comfortably. Inside was a particle board desk, a few crooked family photos, and a squeaky swivel chair. "You'd like to review all the accounts," I nodded. I'm not actually sure how many there are. Charles handled everything. I just knew we had a savings and a checking account. But now I need to know what I have. Helen nodded, turning her monitor away from me as her fingers flew across the keyboard. The rhythmic clicking seemed to make my heart beat faster. "Yes, here we are," she said slowly. Then her brow furrowed. "There's the joint savings account, just as you said, but there's another account solely in your name and a few sub-accounts that I'm guessing you didn't know about." I paused. "Solely in my name." Helen nodded. "Yes, it's an independent savings account opened about 4 years ago." I shook my head. I've never come to the bank to open anything. Helen turned the monitor around to show me a power of attorney form. My signature was on it, clear and neat. I looked closely. It was indeed my signature, but I didn't remember signing it. I only knew that Charles would occasionally have me sign things he said were for insurance or address updates. The last time was when we had our house number officially changed 2 years ago. "Perhaps your husband had you sign it when you updated your address," Helen suggested gently. I said nothing. I remembered Charles saying, "It's just a formality, honey. You don't need to read it." And I had believed him. Helen continued scrolling. "This is a bit strange. Some of the other documents also have Mr. Charles's signature, but the handwriting, it's slightly different." I frowned. Different how Helen pulled up another authorization form on the screen. "This signature looks stiffer. The strokes are heavy, lacking the natural flow he always had." I had lived with Charles for 3 decades. I knew his handwriting, especially the way the H in his name always had a slight curve at the end, while the one on the screen was abrupt without that softness. I pressed my lips together. "May I take a picture of that?" Helen looked at me for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, of course." I took out my phone, my hand trembling slightly, and photographed each document. I didn't know what I would do with them, but I knew I wouldn't let this go. Before leaving, I used the bank's restroom. In the mirror, I looked as if I'd aged another few years. My neatly cut silver hair had a stray lock that I hadn't bothered to fix this morning. I looked into my own eyes. They weren't red-rimmed like at the funeral, but they no longer held the sparkle of my early years as a wife. I sighed, bracing my hands on the sink. "Charles," whispered, "you left all of this for me, but I need to know, did it all really come from you?" I straightened my blouse, put my phone in my purse, and walked out. The April sun was bright, making me squint, but this time I didn't flinch. I was beginning to see clearly, and perhaps it was time I dared to look the truth straight in the eye. If you have ever trusted someone completely, only to discover the empty spaces they left behind, I hope you'll stay. I didn't go straight home after leaving the bank. I drove aimlessly for a while past familiar streets where Charles and I used to buy plants for the backyard, or where he would point and say, "They built that roof all wrong." See, I parked outside an old deli and bought a cold-cut sandwich I couldn't manage more than half of. It tasted like cotton, but I needed something to keep my mind sharp. I looked at the photos from the bank again. Documents, signatures, numbers, fine print. It all looked legal, but the feeling in my gut didn't. It was a low, persistent hum of suspicion that wouldn't go away. I remembered the one person who could help me understand what Charles had left behind, Nancy Doyle, the long-time accountant for Henderson Construction. Charles had always trusted her. "She knows the company better than I do," he used to say. I made the call. Nancy's voice sounded surprised at first, but when I said my name, she went quiet for a few seconds before responding in a gentle tone. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm so sorry about Charles. Would you like to stop by the office? I still have all his files." The accounting office was in a small commercial plaza at the end of Jefferson Street. I'd been there once over a decade ago when Charles had asked me to drop off that year's tax file because he was down with the flu. The office hadn't changed much: beige cubicle walls, a slightly worn carpet in the walkway, and the same smell of stale pre-brewed coffee. Nancy came out to greet me. She was about the age my daughter would have been if I'd had one. Dark brown hair in a loose bun, a cream-colored blouse, and an old gray scarf. But it was her eyes that took my breath away. They were filled with such compassion. "We haven't taken down any of the photos," Nancy said, as she led me into a room, gesturing to a wall where a picture of Charles stood with his construction crew. He was smiling, his hand on the shoulder of Ben, his lead foreman, a man who would play a bigger role in this story later. I sat down. Nancy pulled a file from a drawer and placed it in front of me. Before he passed, Mr. Charles transferred all of Henderson Construction into a trust. "The sole beneficiary is you, Elaine." I blinked. Nancy nodded. "Yes, you." All the shares, assets, contracts, it was all moved from his name to the trust about 5 years ago. I felt like someone had poured ice water down my neck. I tried to keep my voice steady. Why did he never tell me? Nancy hesitated. He said to save it for when it was needed. And he also said that if you came here on your own, I should give you this. She opened a drawer and took out a sealed, faded envelope with Charles's handwriting on the front. "Elaine, open only when you're ready." I took it, my hand trembling slightly. Nancy discreetly left the room. I opened the letter. The paper was slightly yellowed, the black ink still clear. It was Charles's handwriting. No doubt I'd seen it on 1,000 Christmas cards. Thanksgiving notes and bills he'd stuck to the fridge for me. "Elaine, I know you might be sitting alone as you read this. And if you're here in Nancy's office, then I'm probably not with you anymore. I thought a lot about this, whether I should tell you sooner or just quietly arrange things. In the end, I chose to trust you, to trust that when the time came, you would know what to do. I never wanted you to be in a position where you had to bow your head or beg. Not from anyone, not even our own son. I tried to teach Derek what was right, but some lessons can only be learned through loss, and I didn't want you to be the sacrifice he had to make to learn it. The trust is for you. The company is yours. Not because I want to burden you, but because you deserve to be the one to hold on to what I built. Tessa is a sharp woman, but I saw the look in her eyes whenever money came up. I was wrong not to tell you sooner. But now you know. Use everything I've left to protect yourself just as you've always protected this family. I love you, and I believe in you. Charles. I read it twice. My vision blurred not from smeared ink but from tears. It was the first time I had cried since the funeral, not out of sadness, but out of pain. I had scolded Charles for being wary of Tessa. "Don't be so suspicious of your son's wife," I'd said, my voice sharp with irritation. He had just stayed quiet, and the next day he made me breakfast as usual. I thought he had given in. It turned out he hadn't. He had been quietly preparing. I sat there in that small office surrounded by company papers and photos of a smiling Charles. I no longer felt like a helpless widow. I was beginning to understand that I might not have been ready, but Charles had been ready for me. I folded the letter, put it in my purse, and walked out of the office. The afternoon light hit my face. It wasn't a harsh sun, but I still had to squint. Not from the glare, but because for the first time in weeks I felt like I was truly opening my eyes. If you've ever placed your full trust in a family member, only to be met with manipulation, don't miss the next chapter. I got home late in the afternoon. The day was overcast, not quite rainy, but the sky was a pale gray, as if it too wanted to be silent with me. I didn't turn on the radio switch on any lights or even take off my coat. I just sat down on the old sofa in the corner of the living room where Charles used to read the paper and clutched my purse like a life raft. I pulled out the letter and read it again. Each time a new layer of emotion surfaced, sorrow, regret, but this time anger. Not at Charles. At myself for being so trusting, for refusing to see the obvious signs for so many years. The times Tessa had eyed Charles's wallet, the times Derek had deflected when I asked about his personal finances, and his clever silence whenever Charles mentioned writing a will. I called Nancy again. Her voice on the phone was still calm and professional, but I could hear a new note of caution. "I need to ask you something," I said. "Did Charles ever take out a mortgage on our house?" In his name, Nancy was silent for a few seconds. "I'll have to check," she said, "but I do recall a loan in Charles's name for about $200,000 taken out nearly 2 years ago." My hand tightened around the phone. "Can you send me a copy of that paperwork?" "Yes, I'll scan it and email it over." I thanked her and hung up. 10 minutes later, the file was in my inbox. When I opened it, my heart skipped a beat. Borrower, Charles Whitmore, date signed, June 2nd, years prior. Use of funds, direct transfer, DW Ventures, LLC. I stared at that line as if it had been carved into the paper with a knife. DW was my son's initials, Derek Whitmore. But why was the money transferred to a company with that name? I scrolled down to the signature. It was Charles's name. But the handwriting, it was stiff, uneven, the curves not as soft as his usually were. I wasn't an expert, but my gut screamed, "No, this is not my husband's handwriting." I opened my phone again, pulling up the photos I'd taken at the bank. One was of a form Charles himself had signed 3 years ago. I enlarged both images, placing them side by side on my laptop screen. The difference was stark. The C in Charles's real signature always had a soft curve leaning slightly to the right. In the loan agreement, the C was upright and stark, as if copied by a left hand. The final stroke of the E in Whitmore was shorter than usual and stopped abruptly, like someone imitating without feeling the natural rhythm of the hand. I wasn't a handwriting expert, but I was Charles's wife for 32 years. I knew his script like I knew the lines on my own wrist. I printed the document and laid it on the table. I didn't cry. At this point, I was tired of wiping away tears. I just sat there, my hand resting on the paper, and took a deep breath. If Derek had done this, if he had dared to forge his own father's signature to take out a massive loan for his private company, then this was no longer just a family dispute. This was fraud. This was betrayal. This was a knife in the back. I searched my email looking up the name DW Ventures LLC. I found a company profile registered in the state of California with the legal representative listed as Derek Whitmore. The company address was a rental property in San Mateo, not an office. I moved the files into a new folder on my computer. I named it The Reckoning. In the afternoon, I made myself a cup of tea. As I sat watching the steam rise, my phone buzzed. It was Ava. The text had only 11 words. Are you okay? Mom told me not to text, but I was worried. I stared at the message, a lump forming in my throat. That child had always been the only bright spot between those two. She had been closer to me than to her own mother since she was little. She once told me I was the only one in the house who doesn't have a fake smile. I didn't reply right away. I took a screenshot of the message and saved it to the folder. I was saving everything now as if I were building a fortress around myself, one brick at a time. I stood up and took Ben Carter's business card from an old drawer in Charles's study. The construction manager, the man Charles trusted almost like family. I dialed the number and waited. He picked up after 2 rings. Ben, it's me, Elaine Whitmore. His voice was warm and polite. Hello, Elaine. I'm so sorry about Charles. I still can't believe he's gone. I know. I can't either, but I'm calling about something else today. Of course, whatever you need. I need to see you, not at the office. I want to meet in private. Maybe tonight. Ben hesitated for only a second. Of course, I'm free after 6. Where would you like to meet? I'll stop by the equipment yard on the north side. Do you remember the container Charles used as a temporary office? I have the key. Ben chuckled softly. Yeah, I remember the place. I'll see you there at 6:30. I hung up and stood in the dim study where Charles used to sit checking invoices, writing me little notes whenever he had to leave early. An old note was still stuck to the file cabinet with a magnet. I'll be home late. Make sure you eat lunch. Don't wait up. See, I placed my hand on it. For the first time, I didn't feel pain. I felt clarity. I felt anger. I felt ready. If you've ever been caught between truth and blood, what would you choose? Arrived 10 minutes early. The yard was on the north side of town, a plot of land Charles had leased for decades initially just for temporary storage. He used to call it the beating heart of the company, a place for equipment supplies and, occasionally, a place for him to hide when he didn't want to listen to Tessa talk about cryptocurrency. I parked next to the old office container. The key was still in its usual spot, hanging on a rusty nail by the door. Charles always left it there, saying, anyone who knows their way here can be trusted to open it. When I pushed the door open, a light cloud of dust danced in the air. The space still smelled of machine oil, metal, and old coffee. The fluorescent light flickered once before staying on. I sat down in a folding chair, opened my purse, and laid the envelope with the original trust documents on the desk. At exactly 6:30, Ben arrived. He walked in his work gloves, still on his shirt stained with grease. Seeing me, he pulled off the gloves, wiped his hands on a rag, and nodded. Evening. Elaine? Ben. We looked at each other for a few seconds. Nothing more needed to be said. My eyes said enough. He pulled up a chair and sat opposite me, his back straight, his gaze direct. I'm guessing you didn't come here to talk about concrete suppliers. I nodded. I need to know everything. Ben exhaled, leaning back slightly. I figured it was about time. I pushed the file toward him. Charles left a power of attorney. You are the current legal manager. I am the sole beneficiary of the trust. Ben glanced at the envelope, then nodded. I knew he had something prepared, but I didn't know the details. I tilted my head. Then tell me what you do know. Ben placed his hands on the desk, lacing his fingers together. His voice was steady, but tense. Derek came here at least 4 times in the last 2 years, always when Charles wasn't around. He'd say he was going to a client meeting, but he was really just avoiding the kid. I said nothing. Ben continued. The first time Derek asked about our ongoing contracts, who was paying, who was behind the cash flow, everything. I told him I had no authority to share that information without Charles's approval. He said he was his son, he didn't need permission. I gritted my teeth. What did you do? I told him straight. I only take orders from the man who signs my paychecks. And that's not him. A small, grim smile touched my lips. Good. Ben leaned forward. Another time, Derek demanded to open the equipment warehouse, said he wanted to assess assets for liquidation if the company changed its business model. I asked him, who told you the company was liquidating anything? He just gave me this half smirk. Did you open it for him? No. I called Charles right after, and he banned him from the yard from then on. But Derek still hung around the construction sites. It was like he was planning to take something. My hand tightened into a fist. I don't think he was just planning. I think he was already doing it. I told Ben about the $200,000 loan with the forged signature, about DW Ventures LLC and my recent discoveries. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he just nodded slowly. It's not that I didn't see something like this coming, he said, but I didn't think he'd go that far. I opened the envelope again and took out the paper Charles had signed. This is a copy of the confirmation from the trust. From now on, if anyone wants anything from the company, the office, or this yard, they go through me. Ben looked at me, and for the first time I saw a different kind of look in his eyes. Not pity, not polite deference. It was respect. I'm no longer the person they give orders to, I said, my voice low. I'm the one holding what they thought they already had. He gave a nod so slight it was almost a bow. Elaine, I'm with you. I took a deep breath and stood up. Thank you. I don't need a lot of people. I just need one I can trust. He rose with me. Then you've got one. I turned and walked out the door. The cool evening air, smelling of sawdust and faint gasoline, blew against my face. For the first time in weeks, I no longer felt like I was on the sidelines of a life someone else was controlling. I was stepping into the center of it. I woke up early that day, earlier than any morning since Charles's funeral. The sky was still dim, dew clung to the kitchen window, and I still wasn't used to drinking my coffee alone. But there was no room for sorrow today. Today, I needed to be sharp to stand tall, and to remember exactly who I was. I chose a long-sleeved, light blue blouse that Charles had always liked. Not because I needed to look pretty, but because I wanted to feel steady, and that shirt made me feel as if he were still here, watching from a quiet corner. I had rearranged the living room the night before. The oak coffee table was cleared and polished, the documents neatly organized into 3 files, one for the trust fund, one for the company, and one for Derek's loan. Next to each file was a bottle of water and a glass, not as a gesture of hospitality, but to make it clear this was not a family meal. This was a meeting I was leading. I wasn't shaking. I'd done enough of that in the past few weeks. At 10 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. I didn't rush. I answered it as if I were greeting a real estate appraiser, because I knew in their eyes that's all I represented, an asset to be divided. Tessa walked in first. She strode straight ahead, no greeting, no glance around. Her expensive handbag swung onto the sofa as if it had always belonged there. Derek followed a laptop under his arm, his eyes avoiding mine. I didn't invite them to sit, but they sat anyway. I took my place at the head of the table. Hello, you two, I began, my voice calm. I assume we're here to talk about assets. Tessa glanced at Derek, but it was Derek who spoke first. Mom, I think it's best we handle this in an orderly and legal manner. I am the executor of Dad's will. I have a responsibility to manage the estate until the division is complete. I nodded as if listening to a student present a poorly prepared assignment. And for that reason, Derek continued, I need to get a clear picture of all remaining assets, especially the construction company and this house. We need to get them appraised and prepare a plan to handle them. Tessa cut in. We've already spoken to a lawyer. They're ready to assist if you agree to cooperate. You know, everything will be easier if you just work with us. I smiled, but it wasn't a soft smile. It was the smile of someone who already knew the answer to the equation everyone else was still trying to solve. I pulled the first file toward me, the trust deed. I placed it squarely in front of them. Henderson Construction is not part of Charles's estate, I said. 5 years ago, he transferred the entire company into a trust. The sole beneficiary is me. Derek stiffened. Tessa's eyebrows shot up. I continued. I have full operational control. No one else, not even the executor, has any right to interfere with the company. I slid the second file forward, the loan records. As for personal finances, Derek, you borrowed a total of $96,000 from the company through contracts with clear signatures. You have not made a single payment on time. Every time you called your father, my dear Dad, he signed another extension. But everything was recorded, every number, every date. Derek opened his mouth, but I held up a hand to stop him. I'm not finished. I took the final file, the one that would make both of them go pale. Charles mortgaged this house 18 months ago. The amount $350,000. The entire sum was transferred into the trust. Legally, this house is now my asset. Silence. Not the silence of shock. The silence of people watching their calculations dissolve into thin air. I stood up and looked at them, the two people who had abandoned me, the ones who had told me I should find somewhere smaller to live. I was a guest in my own home, I said slowly. Not anymore. Now I'm the owner with the keys, and the bank statements in my name. Tessa shot to her feet. Her voice was shrill, shattering the quiet in the room. You old woman, you manipulated him. You made him change everything. His assets belonged to this family, not for you to hoard and play queen of the castle. I looked her straight in the eye. He was mine. We lived together for 32 years, and now everything he left behind is for me to live out the rest of my life. Alone, but not helpless. Tessa swore, snatched her purse, and slammed the door on her way out. Derek remained seated, his hands still resting on the laptop he had never opened. I didn't expect you to be this prepared, he mumbled. I said nothing. I just looked at him, no longer the little boy I used to comfort on rainy nights, but a grown man, greedy, weak, and ungrateful. He stood up slowly, gave a stiff nod, and followed his wife out. Not a single word of apology. I didn't feel relief. I just felt that I had finally gotten up from the chair someone else had placed me in for so many years. I would be leaving that house not because I was pushed out, but because I chose to leave. And in my new place, I would find the one thing they never understood about me, freedom. I packed my things in silence. No background music, no one to help, no goodbyes. I didn't need anyone. I just needed time, and I was taking it back minute by minute, breath by breath. That morning I called a moving company. The man on the phone asked for the destination, and I gave him an address in Mendocino. A house by the sea, he asked. You're moving there, Lone, I just said. Yes, and offered no further explanation. I packed box after box of books, bowl after bowl. The things I had once cherished for my family, even though that very family had chosen to abandon me. Some items I threw out immediately, the set of glass tumblers from Tessa, the tablecloth Derek bought on sale at a flea market last year. But I kept the old things, a cookbook with a broken spine, a chipped vase that was Charles's 20th anniversary gift to me. I left no note, wrote no letter. I didn't need anyone to understand. I just needed them to one day see an empty house, and to understand that this time I left because I chose to, not because anyone forced me. The door clicked shut behind me, a dry, final sound. It wasn't the sound of a farewell. It was the sound of release. The drive to Mendocino took over 3 hours, but it didn't feel long. I looked out the window at the rows of trees along the highway, the misty fields, and found myself remembering the first time Charles took me to meet his parents. Back then he drove an old van, and I sat beside him with a basket of warm bread on my lap. "We'll start over," he'd said from the kitchen, from the bed, from a small yard with flowers. I remembered all the times I'd cleaned the house for Tessa's parties, straightening messy napkins, wiping down chairs. I used to be proud of being the capable mother. Looking back now, I realized I was just an organizer for other people's lives. The house in Mendocino appeared after a small cypress-lined slope. I'd been here once many years ago, but didn't remember it well. It was smaller than the old house, but airy and bright. A red-tiled roof, white shutters, and a front yard with a few old lavender bushes. I let myself in with the key James, my lawyer, had given me. He left this in his personal files. The wooden floors still smelled of polish. On the kitchen counter was a small box. Inside was a card. Charles's handwriting unmistakable. "For Elaine, when you're ready to choose a space of your own." No more footsteps outside the door, only the sound of the waves. I sat down, holding the card as if I were holding forgiveness, not from him, but from myself. I had forgiven myself for being silent for too long, for enduring things that were no longer worth it. In the afternoon, I brewed a pot of tea. As I poured it, I noticed a small folded piece of paper in the tea box. I opened it. Ava's handwriting, small, slanted, a little messy. "They forbid me from calling you. But they can't forbid my heart. You're still the only one who loves me unconditionally." I couldn't hold it in anymore. Tears fell onto my hand, but I didn't sob. They were just tears, like residual grains of salt washing away what needed to be forgotten. Ava had always sensed the things adults tried to hide. Even as a child, she could read eyes. The one time I'd scolded her for drawing on the living room wall, she had just lowered her head and said, "You're sad about something else, I know." I knew now that she still saw me, truly saw me. That evening, I hung a small hand-carved wooden sign on the front door. In white paint, it read, "My house. Do not knock unless you do so with respect." I stepped out onto the porch. The sky was growing dark. The ocean murmured in the distance. I sat down in the rocking chair and poured more tea. My heart wasn't light, but it was steady, like firm earth after a heavy rain. I didn't know what lay ahead. Maybe lawsuits. Maybe a long silence. But I knew one thing for sure: I was no longer in the shadows. I no longer had to ask for permission to exist. I had chosen the light, and this time it was my own. If you've ever been pushed to a wall, but chose to stand tall, continue this journey with me. I had thought that after moving to Mendocino, things would slowly quiet down. I was wrong. Less than 3 weeks after Derek and Tessa walked out of the old house, I received a letter from a law firm in Sacramento, along with a copy of a lawsuit. They were suing me. More specifically, they were suing me for unlawful possession of inherited assets, lack of transparency in the trust's beneficiary status, and exerting undue influence on the deceased. I read all 4 pages slowly. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't even surprised. I just felt pity. Because it turned out my son, the one I had rushed to the emergency room when his fever hit 104, was now claiming in writing that I had abused emotional influence to acquire assets outside of the will. I placed the lawsuit on the kitchen table, poured a glass of water, and called James Patterson, the lawyer who had handled all of Charles's documents, and the man I had come to trust most since this all began. "Stay calm, Elaine," James said over the phone, his voice always even and unhurried. "I anticipated this, but rest assured we have everything. 3 days later, I was sitting at the pine desk in my small living room with James and a thick binder he had prepared. Every document had an original signature, a notary seal, and a clear date from Nancy, from Charles, from the tax accountant, from the bank. We didn't just have papers, we had a plan. The hearing took place at the county courthouse. The room wasn't large, with long wooden benches, a high ceiling, and cold lighting. I wore a white blouse and a light gray blazer. Not to impress, but because it was how Charles would have wanted me to look when I needed people to see me for who I was. Derek and Tessa arrived with their own lawyer, young, with slicked back hair and an expensive suit. He looked at me with that, "she's just an old woman who doesn't understand the law" expression. I had been looked at that way more times than I could count. Their lawyer began questioning whether the trust was established under a lack of transparency, that Charles had been under psychological influence in his final years, and that there were signs of emotional coercion. I didn't respond. James sat beside me, unhurried. When it was his turn, he simply opened his binder and presented the original documents to the judge one by one. "Your Honor." James said the trust was established 5 years before Mr. Charles Whitmore's passing, during a time when he was in full health of sound mind and actively running his company. This is all confirmed by his accountant, his family doctor, and the legal firm that filed the paperwork. He presented another file. "And this is a loan from Henderson Construction to the plaintiff, Mr. Derek Whitmore, for a total of $96,000. There is a contract, a signature, and there have been no payments made since the loan was issued." He turned to Derek, his voice not harsh but almost concerned. "Mr. Whitmore, why did you borrow money from your father and not repay it? And why is your mother, the woman who was told to leave her home, now the sole financial officer of the company?" The room went silent. Derek shifted in his seat, his head bowed. Then James delivered the final blow, an excerpt from the California State Business Registry, DW Ventures LLC, Derek's company, where he had funneled the forged loan from Charles. The record showed the company had ceased operations 4 months prior, no taxes filed, no cash flow, no assets. The file clearly stated loan from Henderson Construction was used as initial investment capital, never repaid. Tessa turned to her husband, whispering something I couldn't hear, but I saw the fire in her eyes. As they left the courthouse, she hissed through her teeth, "You trusted her, and now you've lost everything." I stood up slowly. I didn't look at her. I just looked out the large window on the side of the courtroom where a patch of blue sky and a row of trees swayed gently in the wind. Peaceful. No arguments. 3 weeks later, the verdict came. The court denied their entire claim to the assets. It recognized the trust fund as legally valid. Derek and Tessa were ordered to repay the $96,000 over a period of 8 years. If they defaulted, their wages would be garnished and assets seized. I received the notice in the mail that afternoon, just as I was brewing a pot of tea. I set the envelope aside, not rushing to open it. I wanted to wait until the water was fully boiled. After pouring my tea, I sat out on the porch. The sea breeze felt gentler today. I opened the letter and read each line. Not a single word made my heart pound. It was just a confirmation of what I already knew. I was not wrong. I did not need to bow my head. The phone rang. It was Ben. "I'm guessing you just read it," he said, a hint of cheer in his voice. "I did. I'm having some tea." Ben laughed. "Well, I thought you'd like to know. Company revenue was up 12% last quarter. The Petaluma project just signed 2 new contracts." I smiled. "Good. Everything is on the right track." "Just like you did with your life," Ben said, before quietly hanging up. I sat there for a long while, the tea growing cool in my cup. I didn't feel as happy as I thought I would. But I felt right. And for me, right was enough. I received the letter on a Tuesday morning. The mailman was the same familiar man with silver hair. He'd slip the mail through the wooden slot in the porch door and give a nod as I made tea in the kitchen. I didn't open it right away, nor did I think much of it at the time. I was busy trimming the lavender bushes in the yard, then cleaning the south-facing window. I liked the feeling of keeping my own home clean, no longer dependent on anyone, no longer waiting for someone to remind me. When I picked up the stack of mail from the floor, my eyes stopped on an envelope with no letterhead, just one word written neatly in blue pen, Mom. I sat down in the chair by the window where the morning sun slanted through the small trees. My hands slowly unfolded the paper. Inside was a single sheet folded in half. The handwriting was familiar but shaky, as if written with great hesitation. Mom, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope to take responsibility. Not because the court is making me, but because I need to. I thought I understood everything about the company, about the will, about our family. It turns out I didn't understand anything at all. I kept thinking Dad had left too little, that he didn't care about my future. But he did care, he just cared for the right person. I'm sorry for hurting you. Every day I work overtime, every time I make that first loan payment, I think of you. Not the you of today, but the mom who used to bring me lunch all summer. The mom who wrapped birthday presents by hand, the mom who always left a slice of apple pie on the kitchen counter even when I didn't come home. I don't expect forgiveness, but if one day you want to have tea with me, I'll be there. Derek. I read the letter 3 times. Each time I paused on a different line. The first time I stopped at, he just cared for the right person. The second time I stopped at, I remember the slice of apple pie on the kitchen counter. The last time I stopped at the simplest sentence of all, I'll be there. There were no excuses, no justifications, and for what felt like the first time in years, there was honesty. I didn't cry. I didn't write a reply. I just stood up, went into the bedroom, and opened the small drawer in the old wooden dresser. Inside was a small oak box square with a sliding lid that Charles had custom made for our 30th anniversary. On the lid he had carved the word Grace, not a name but what he called me, when I did something with a patience and gentleness he felt he lacked. You have a grace I don't, he used to say. I opened the box. Inside was the letter he had left for me, the one from Nancy's office. The paper was beginning to yellow, the creases softer from how many times I had opened it. I placed Derek's letter next to it, carefully folded. I slid the lid shut. It wasn't locked, but it was closed enough to hold what needed to be held. That night, as I wrote a few lines in my journal, a habit I'd kept since moving to Mendocino, I wrote, "They say forgiveness is about letting go. I think it's about daring to hold a silence that outlasts the screams of resentment. Not a silence of avoidance, but a silence that allows things to settle. To wait for the other person to learn how to walk on their own 2 feet without you leading the way." I closed the journal, cleared away my tea, and sat on the porch. The breeze from the ocean carried a light scent of salt. Not cold, not harsh, just enough to remind you that there are things out there bigger than sorrow, bigger even than anger. Before going to bed, I checked my phone, a habit I was trying to break but still repeated each night. There was a text from Ava, my granddaughter. "Grandma, my parents are changing, but I don't need them to change to love you." I sat on my bed for a full 10 minutes after that message, just staring at the dark screen. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to hold on to that moment a little longer. I replied to Ava with a single line, "Love doesn't need rules. It just needs truth." And for the first time in months, I turned off the light without a weight on my chest. I never thought I'd be the one holding a microphone in front of a crowd. I'm not the type who enjoys public speaking. I'm used to being in the kitchen, setting the table, not standing at a podium sharing something profound. But one day I got a call from Linda, Nancy's daughter, the accountant who had helped me so much when everything began. Elaine, Linda said, her voice a mix of excitement and respect. I'm organizing a small get-together for older women who have experienced financial abuse within their families. I remember my mom telling me your story, and I thought if you'd be willing, you could be an inspiration to them. I was silent for a few seconds, not because I didn't want to, but because I'd never considered myself an inspiration to anyone. I thought I was the one who cleared the table, who greeted the guests, who kept the peace when everything was about to explode. But maybe now I was someone else. I accepted. The talk was held in the small reading room of the town library. Cream-colored walls, neat wooden tables and chairs, and soft yellow light. It wasn't formal or showy, just my style. When I stepped up to the small wooden lectern, there were about 20 women sitting in the audience. They looked at me not with expectation, but with the eyes of people who had heard too many things they didn't need to hear. They didn't want a speech. They wanted a real story. I took the microphone, took a deep breath, and began like this. My name is Elaine. I am 71 years old. A week after my husband died, my son told me to leave my home. But the story I'm here to tell isn't one of pain. I'm here to tell you about how I started living again at an age when others told me it was too late. We are not just mothers or wives. We are the pillars of our own lives. And if you think you're too old to start over, just ask me. I was reborn at 71. Not because someone saved me, but because I learned how to save myself. And I believe if I can do it, you can too. No one applauded. But I saw their eyes change. I saw an older woman on the left give a slow nod. Another placed a hand on her chest. And I knew I was no longer just telling a story for myself. I was telling it for them. Life in Mendocino was strangely peaceful but not lonely. Henderson construction was still running smoothly. Ben called me every week, usually on a Friday, just to give a brief report. We're up 8% this quarter. The new contract is signed. Then came his familiar line. Thank you for holding on to what Charles left behind. Ava came to visit me on the third weekend of every month. Her mother might not have known or pretended not to know. But we weren't hiding. She would bring her sketchbook, usually filled with drawings of me reading on the porch or making tea or looking out at the ocean. Once she drew me as a small boat floating on the waves but not sinking. I asked her why there were no oars, and she said, because you don't need them. I started learning to play the piano. A neighbor taught me a few basic notes. The first song I practiced was I Did It My Way. I hit a lot of wrong notes, the rhythm was off, but I wasn't flustered. I smiled because I was doing something just for me. That evening, I sat on the porch, a gentle breeze blowing a glass of red wine in my hand. No one called. No one needed anything from me. And I knew this was the freedom I had spent years searching for. I raised my glass toward the sea and whispered, Charles, you didn't leave me a rescue, you left me a map. And I walked the whole way on my own 2 feet. I didn't wait for the wind to reply. I just looked at the sky, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel lost in the silence. Afterward, a letter to the women like me. If you are still here after the long journey I've shared, I want to say this to you, thank you. Not for listening to my story, but for giving me the chance to be more real, not in the past, but right here in the present. I didn't tell my story for pity. I told it because I know there are so many women like me, women who have lived their entire lives for others only to one day find themselves pushed out of everything they ever built. We used to think that being a good mother, a devoted wife, was enough to keep everything peaceful. But life doesn't promise us fairness. Our children do not owe us gratitude. Our husbands aren't always strong enough to protect us until the very end. And no one besides ourselves can decide what we are worth. I used to feel like a shadow in my own home. I used to believe that silence was the way to keep the peace, but in the end, I realized this: if you stay silent for too long, people will forget you ever had a voice. I was 71 when I started my life over. When I moved into that small house by the sea, I thought I was too late. But it turns out age isn't a limit, it's just a milestone to remind us. If not now, when I don't have a formula for happiness. But I am sure of one thing: we were not born just to exist for others. We too deserve to live a meaningful life without asking for permission. If you are a woman entering your 50s, 60s, or 70s, if you feel you are being slowly pushed to the margins of your own family in the very house you once ran, I just want to send you a hug through these words. Look back at your life and ask, who have I lived for, and who do I want to live for now? No one has the right to extinguish your light, just because you've grown accustomed to living in the shadows. Now it's your turn. Have you been through something similar? Are you going through a transformation of your own, or are you simply wondering, does anyone out there understand me? Please leave a comment. Share your story or even just a single feeling. Because you never know, somewhere out there another woman might feel heard, all thanks to you. I'm here. I read everyone, and I believe you deserve to write your own final chapter.